Hello and welcome to this 1-hour webinar where we are talking about safeguarding during the pandemic and beyond. And it's brought to you in association with the safeguarding software specialists Impero Software. I am Ceri LOCKETT and I'm going to be hosting this 1-hour session, and we're going to introduce our panel to you first of all. And if everyone can give a little wave as I introduce your names. So we have got with us Chief Constable Simon Bailey, who is the National Police Chiefs Council Lead for Child Protection and also Chief Constable of Norfolk Police. So welcome to you. Thanks for joining us. We also have Claude Knights, who is an independent consultant on family and child protection issues. So a little wave from Claude there. Ceri Stokes is with us, Assistant Head and Designated Safeguarding Lead at Kimbolton School in Cambridgeshire. Hi to you. Also, Charlotte Aynsley, former head of safeguarding at Beckter, which was the lead government agency for the promotion and integration and rollout of IT in education. And she's now an online safety consultant and safeguarding advisor at Impero. So hello to you there. A quick wave, lovely. And also we have Justin Reilly, who is CEO of Impero, which is the safeguarding specialists. So just a quick word about the logistics of this session today. As I say, it's going to be an hour. It's being recorded, and so it'll be posted online shortly after we finish today. So if you miss anything yourself or didn't record it yourself, then you'll be able to get all of that information. And we're going to be taking questions from our attendees, from our audience. So you need to post those in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. If you accidentally put it in the chat function, that's fine as well. Our admins, our moderators will pick that up, but the Q&A function is the best place. And you can put, if you want a question asked of a particular person, then put who you want that asked of, or if you want to ask it generally for the panel. So let us know about that. So basically what we're talking about today is schools across the UK have been mostly closed since the end of March to most pupils. They are open, of course, for at-risk children and also the children of key workers. So at the beginning of this term, it was reported, though, that only some 1 in 20 eligible children turned up. And so almost 500,000 vulnerable children were not attending. Also, child protection referrals have fallen by 50% during this period in some areas of the UK during lockdown. And so implying teachers have a huge role to play ordinarily in safeguarding. So new research commissioned by Impero since the lockdown shows that almost 90% of teachers consider safeguarding a large part of their job, and they're worried that school closures are negatively affecting the safeguarding of children. Nearly 3/4 of teachers have contacted at-risk pupils during the lockdown to tell them where they can go if they need safeguarding help. And also more than 2/3 have or they intend to flag concerns about at-risk pupils to local authority social care teams. So this research, the researchers spoke to 300 teachers around the UK, and nearly half of those are logging safeguarding concerns manually. So that means either via email or via an Excel system or paper records. So what we're going to talk about first of all is we're going to have a sort of two areas of main topics that we're talking about. We're going to talk first of all about lockdown safeguarding concerns and lessons learned for next time. And I'm going to start and dive straight into our questions. And I'm going to pick on Chief Constable Simon Bailey, first of all, actually, to ask you basic question first. What are we talking about when we're talking about safeguarding? How big a problem is it? What kind of issues are we talking about, Simon?
Sarah, I think we have to recognise that we're talking about a significant number of issues, and perhaps not just what we would describe as the traditional types of concerns. So we would all recognise that there is a growing body of evidence around adverse childhood experiences and the impact that that can then have upon later life, your development, both physically and mentally, the implications it has for career opportunities, your own physical and mental well-being. And so I'm concerned about the potential implications of exposure to adverse childhood experiences. I'm obviously concerned around familial abuse within the family environment, and people are closely associated with the environment. Traditional child sexual abuse, which still accounts for 60% of all child sexual abuse that is reported to us. There is then, of course, the growing online threat. And we know that there are a group of men overwhelmingly out there that have a predetermined sexual interest in children and will go online to groom children. So we know children are spending more and more time online with all the risks that are associated with that. And then, of course, what we are also seeing, in the Internet Watch Foundation has published these figures, that a third of all new indecent images of children are self-generated. Within lockdown, I cannot help but think that children will also be sharing sexualized images of themselves. In a lot of cases, it's a consensual sharing of an image, but there isn't an understanding and appreciation of, once that image has gone from your phone, is then in the possession of somewhere else, you then lose control of it.
And are there any sort of figures, or in terms of numbers of people that we're talking about, numbers of children? Is there anything, would you have any of that kind of information?
No, not the numbers of children, but the National Crime Agency have recently revised the figure of people that have a sexual interest in children from between 66 and 80,000 now up to 300,000. So we know that the internet and technology has opened up a new world and a whole new series of opportunities for people that have a sexual interest in children to what they believe is safely fulfill their sexual fantasies, because of the anonymization of the web and the facilities that are afforded to them. So my concerns are multifaceted. It goes just beyond the fact that the child, when they're in school, is then in the vast majority of the time in a safe environment. That actually it goes beyond just child sexual abuse. It is the online threat, it's the exposure to domestic abuse and chaotic lifestyles, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and the overall impact it might be having on the development of young people. So what we have to be able to start thinking about is, now, how do we ensure that our concerns are raised and acknowledged, and how do we start preparing for what I believe will be the inevitable surge of reports that will come to the safeguarding experts, the practitioners in the field, once there is an easing of lockdown.
That's it, isn't it? If I can come to Charlotte immediately after Simon there. So it's not just children, the sort of traditional abuse, as you were saying, Simon. It's all sorts of things, isn't it? It's bullying, it's grooming. What would you say it encompasses that we're worried about?
Yeah, I think, as Simon's mentioned, some of the sort of, I guess, more well understood issues are happening, like CSA type material, child sexual abuse material, peer-to-peer bullying. But there's also big issues around the circulation of fake news, for example, especially to do with the virus. And you will know that Facebook and other social media sites have taken quite extreme steps to kind of stem the flow of fake information circulating around, to help people make sense of the sorts of things that are online. We've heard awful situations about things like bombing, so bombing meetings with child sexual abuse material, and the vicarious trauma that's suffered by people if they see this sort of material, and actually people not knowing really how to respond to those kinds of situations, especially for children and young people, and for adults as well. And we've seen that happening, which is absolutely, it's just dreadful that people have to see that material. It's really, really traumatizing for people. The other thing that I've certainly been hearing about is, obviously we've got more children online, and they're far more susceptible to scams, for example. I mean, I was talking to a colleague last week about some of the things that are happening around people trying to sell young children FIFA points via Instagram, and then asking them for their passwords. And they're giving their passwords because obviously there's a lot of competition happening in terms of those gaming environments at the moment, and all children want to do really well because they're all competing with each other because they're spending more time online. And they are being more susceptible to scams and people accessing their account and taking the credits from their account. So it's not just some of the more typical incidents of kind of online situations and harm that is happening. It's diversifying into other areas because lots more children are spending more time online.
Claude, what would you say about that you're kind of most worried about, do you think, and that you think is going to be the biggest problem that's being exacerbated during lockdown?
I think I would echo, of course, everything that Simon and Charlotte have said. I'm particularly, from my background in Anti-Bullying Alliance and so on, I'm very worried about the sort of surge in cyberbullying and online bullying. Young people might, when they were in school, they would have had resources in terms of pastoral care and friends who would have been, really working with them and for them. And now they're sort of isolated and not able to call on that support. Parents perhaps don't always understand what's going on in terms of, well, he or she is on the computer, they're doing schoolwork, but actually, other things are happening. Also, even just in terms of the games that they're playing with friends, we know that even on Minecraft, for instance, which so many children and young people are involved in, that the chat rooms, could let strangers in, of course, but there's also the bullying between perhaps unknown parties who can enter the game. So that there are lots and lots of things that are exacerbated because of the extra hours spent online. I'm also worried about the fact that in some families the technology won't actually be sufficiently available for every child. So you've got a sibling rivalry, sibling bullying between siblings as well. It's not an even playing field. We have families who are struggling in terms of providing even the portals, if you like. So that in itself will obviously lead to dislocations when they return to school in terms of opportunities. But yes, it's like a Wild West really, because unfortunately I've spoken to too many parents, even in this, in these last few months, who were under a sense of false illusion that just because the child is, seems to be occupied in a bedroom, everything's well, but they could be almost as much in danger as if they were on a street corner at night. So there are parental aspects.
We don't really know what they're up to at all, do we? We think they're working quietly doing their maths homework. So Ceri, coming to you from Kimbolton School. So how do you think a lockdown has affected schools' outlook on safeguarding? Do you think it's been hard to continue safeguarding in the normal way?
I think definitely, because a lot of our role as a teacher is to talk and try and find out what's going on with a child, and that's when we get the disclosures, and that's when we get them giving us little snippets of information, whereas we don't really get the time to have the chat, and we don't really have them in a situation where we can ask maybe questions to lead them on to things. It could be that if we are doing with older children things like this, we could have the parent in the background, in which case the child might not want to talk to us. So schools are trying to do the best they can with safeguarding, but I feel that they're feeling their hands are tied a lot of the time. The other issue as well is what the definition of vulnerable child is. So we've been having vulnerable children into schools quite a lot recently, and you mentioned that not all vulnerable children have been coming into schools, and that's been an interesting one, because a vulnerable child is only really been defined by having either a social worker or having special educational needs, or is on some kind of threshold with it. I am sure that there are lots of teachers who feel that there are students that should be a vulnerable child but don't meet those criteria, and we really would like them in the schools. But how do you suggest that to a parent without making it sound like you're insulting them or upsetting them, and you're trying to ease them in, saying, we think for that child it would be really great if they were in it. It's a more challenging situation that you've got to tread really carefully with, and not put a child even more danger at home.
Yes, very delicate situation there, isn't it? You've got to tread carefully, as you say, kind of thing. And also coming to Justin Reilly from Impero, do you think that the lockdown has sort of exposed cracks even, or highlighted cracks in the current system of safeguarding children?
Absolutely. So speaking as a former teacher, I can tell you that we're seeing quite a shift in the way safeguarding is being perceived within the classroom in the role of the teacher. It's a huge part of the role of the teacher, and it's often underestimated in terms of the amount of time and effort it takes, as we heard earlier. We're seeing quite a dramatic drop-off in the use of our services. We're seeing quite a drop-off in terms of the number of issues that are being flagged, something like 60% less flags month on month between March and April. So quite a dramatic drop-off. And it's not as if those issues aren't then happening. It's not as if they've been turned off and children aren't at risk of some description. It's that we're just not seeing them. Things we heard earlier, we are expecting teachers to do an awful lot under normal circumstances, but to do it under these circumstances is a far more difficult and far more dangerous activity for a teacher, because you don't want false positives. You don't want to be recording things that are not necessarily real and waste people's time. We are also very concerned about what happens once you flag something. So one of the roles that a teacher has is working to intervene with the child and help them through the situation they find themselves in. And obviously even that is more difficult nowadays as well. If you haven't picked up on the problem, you're even less likely to be able to put an effective intervention in with those children as well.
Yeah, very difficult time, isn't it? Chief Constable, just picking up on that idea about the kind of role of teachers in safeguarding, how big is their role? Would you say they're kind of your eyes and ears?
The academic evidence is very clear that teachers are far more likely to receive a first disclosure of abuse than any other profession. So I think teachers play an absolutely critical role in the well-being, the welfare, the safeguarding of children, and teachers, in my own experience, are probably the first group of professionals that get a sense of something is not quite right within that child. And you only have to look at the work that the police service is now doing with teachers and the education authorities in terms of giving teachers a heads up when a child has been exposed to a domestic abuse in the home. Because I think that again, it puts the teachers on alert. They're then aware of some difficulties in the child's background. It could be as simple as that notice of a concern. It could be the fact that the child is coming in and their clothes are dirty, or they are dirty, or they're hungry. It's all those really, really early signs, which, again, in my experience, teachers are very, very good at picking up on, identifying, and then passing it over to the safeguarding lead within each establishment to turn around and say, we just need to just have a look at what is going on within this child's environment outside of school, because something isn't quite right. And that will be even more important when children return to school.
Would you say all of that picking up on, are they dirty, are they fed, are they hungry, that's just gone out the window now? I don't know who wants to answer that.
Well, I'd like to dive in, actually. It's not just the teachers that are picking up on this. We find in a number of instances it's the children's peers, their friends, their social network that are contributing information on which we need to act. And I think it's extremely important to recognise that a lot of teenagers feel very isolated, not just teenagers. But we did a study in the US, and we think the same is true here, in conjunction with the American Institute of Mental Health. And they recognise that over 80% of teenagers didn't feel that there was an adult in their lives that they could get support from, because they didn't feel that it was relevant, that they understood their context. And well over 60% of those were seeking that support online through relationships they built online, and over 40% of those were doing it with people they'd never met. So it's not just teachers, it's very much the circle that sits around children. And I think it's fair to say, somebody of my age isn't going to be able to sit here and say that I truly understand what my teenage children are going through. I don't. But I should be part of the journey to understanding. So it's parents as well. It should be a whole group of different stakeholders contributing to building that picture. And within schools, we still see many, many, many schools using paper-based systems to try and track what's going on. And that can't be effective. You need to be looking at digital solutions, not just ours. There are others on the market that are very effective. We should be considering how teachers are accessing that digital database, because it spots trends and it's there to flag where there are concerns, and it's specifically designed to put the right information into the right people's hands so they can then go do the intervention. It's worth remembering, of course, that any digital solution is not the solution. We are just a mechanism, a tool, or something to add to the journey. but it's the teachers and the parents thereafter that then have to do something with it and intervene with the children. But it's that.
And I noticed, yeah, you say it is just the tool, isn't it? And I noticed Ceri was nodding there. As a designated safeguarding lead, a DSL, how has your role changed during lockdown, would you say, Ceri?
In some ways, I've gone from more policy writing, more admin, less dealing with the students, which is what I'm good at, or I like to think I'm good at. And so having something where I can document something and record something like a remote safeguarding, not paper, it helps me because then I can get on with my job and try to do Teams meetings with students. Sorry, there's two different questions. One, how my job has changed. My job has changed because it's more paperwork. And if my paperwork can be virtual so other people can see it, then that makes my life much easier. Mm. How has using a virtual system helped? It's helped tremendously. It's made my life so much easier. I can not worry about other people seeing things I don't want them to see, but then I can share with the right people that I want to. It's just made my life so much easier.
So, Charlotte, if I can come to you and just ask you, do you think that the current safeguarding systems should change or should be updated in the light of the school closures during lockdown? Has it thrown up things that we think, oh, actually, this could work better?
Yeah, I mean, first thing to say is I think that schools are doing an incredibly difficult job in very challenging circumstances. And even though people like Ceri are, it's not necessarily official that they have to check in with children who are online and doing remote learning. Keeping children safe in education is the thing that mandates all of our actions around safeguarding children in the educational environment. And I heard someone saying the other day, a DSL, it should be renamed to Keeping Children Safe Outside of Education, because that feels like the new norm. And it's really challenging for teachers to have that check-in that we've just been talking about, to make sure that children are still safe and still okay. And I've heard stories of teachers going to children's back gardens and kind of waving at them to make sure that they are okay. That's the extent that lots and lots of teachers are going to. That being said, I think we do need a little bit more clarity for schools and for teachers, especially if this is going to go on, about where their responsibility ends and how that works with parents and carers, how it works with social workers, how we can bring all of that kind of systematic support together. Because at the moment, as Simon said at the very beginning, teachers are often the port of call and act as that kind of triage mechanism for children to access more support. What that won't do, of course, that clarity, is take away the concerns that many teachers will have about the students that they work with, and importantly, the students that actually aren't in that category at the moment, but teachers and other professionals feel that perhaps they should be. How do you safeguard those children? How do you make sure that those children are having positive experiences at home? I mean, it's incredibly challenging when you're just trying to work, regardless of all of the other things that you might be having to deal with. So I think more clarity would be good, but what it won't do is take away the concerns that teachers have in this area.
Yeah, just a quick reminder to our attendees, our audience who have logged on to watch us and join us today. Just get any questions. I've noticed some questions have been popping up at the bottom of the screen. So if you've got any questions for a particular panelist, then just keep them coming in and we'll collate them and do them towards the end, kind of thing. One of the admins will let me have them and we'll collate them all together. And if I can just ask you, Claude, do you feel there's any main lessons that schools can learn about safeguarding during this period? I don't know whether it's even like a 5-minute chat a week with each pupil, how are things going? I don't know, online,
I mean, the young people and the children that the teachers perhaps have built, a closer relationship with might spring to mind immediately. But I think, yes, you're right. There's so much, it's like an iceberg. There's so much beneath there. There are so many things that we feel about children. We probably are concerned about them. We haven't had time maybe to let that surface. So, but it's very hard. I've been speaking to friends and colleagues who were trying to do this remotely, And as someone mentioned, when you're talking to a child remotely, there may be a sibling or a parent or another member of the family listening in. You know, because the whole thing, usually pastoral care, for instance, is built on confidentiality and privacy. It's very, very hard to recreate that. But one thing that's really coming to my mind listening to colleagues here is just how important it is to put all the different pieces of the puzzles together. You know, when I've been working with a child who's at risk, and maybe I've got 3, 4, 5 bits of the puzzle, but you know, it's the whole thing about working together. And I mean, why so many child protection issues have arisen is because we haven't been joined up, so to speak. You know, there's pieces of the puzzle that are vital that are left out there somewhere. And how to recreate that virtually. I mean, some of the, Ceri was talking about the tools, the technological tools, which obviously can be so helpful, but there's still, you know, that gut thing, that feeling, that one-to-one encounter with a young person, which is so important to put everything into perspective.
Yes, both the high tech and the low tech, the instinctive thing. Just a quick political question before we leave this topic. The Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds, has said that the amount of money that the government sort of puts into supporting frontline services to help vulnerable children is woefully short of the amount that it needs to be. Do you have any thoughts, and I don't really mind who answers this, about, you know, is this area funded enough? I know everything's on a squeeze, isn't it? Who would like to answer that? Anyone particularly?
I'd like to dive in, actually. I think it follows on from what Claude was saying partially. It's very easy to sit back and say there isn't enough money. It's always easy. It's the first thing to default to. There isn't enough money. We need more money. But actually, I think money being spent wisely and understanding where that money should be going is probably the first port of call. So Claude was talking about the fact that you need your gut reaction. You need to be intuitive when you're dealing with children and seeing what you're observing. He's absolutely right. That's one-on-one contact. And it's looking at the people outside of the formal education system and how they contribute to that. So sports clubs, performing arts clubs, these systems need to be available across all those different industries, because something that you may occur that seems small within a school, if you couple that with something that a coach has seen in a swimming pool or in other examples, you might start to build a very different picture, and you might get earlier signs that there's something going on. So I think, is there enough money? Of course there isn't. Of course we need more money to go into it. That's the natural solution. But what we need to be doing is understanding where that funding should be going and providing a huge amount of support and guidance and advice on how the holistic view around a learner can be tackled. How do we actually grab bits of data from across many, many different places to get that view and bring that into one space? So I'm really advocating using money. Yes, more money, absolutely. But let's think really carefully about where it gets spent before we just start putting it into repeating lots of what we're doing right now.
What we're going to talk about now is kind of our second topic, which is the return to school. So primary schools in England might start to reopen from the 1st of June, we are told. This depends on the R number, which is the rate of reproduction of the virus, and the number of new infections staying low. So pupils in reception, year 1 and year 6, might be able to return in stages. And the Prime Minister has said that he also wants secondary school pupils who are doing GCSEs and A-levels next year to get at least some time with their teachers before the school holidays, the summer holidays. And so nothing has been said about nurseries, and there are no plans to reopen schools yet in the rest of the UK. I was talking about England and Wales, that kind of thing. So nothing has been said about that. What needs to be done, though, to make that reintegration successful? Because you can't just say, right, the doors are open, back you come, as I think you've touched on. So if I can ask Chief Constable Simon Bailey, first of all, we've had the head of the teaching union, the NASUWT, Patrick Roach, saying that schools shouldn't open before September. And so how worried are you that just leaves children, at-risk children, just cast adrift, unsupported until September?
Well, the last 29 minutes we've been talking about the risks that not just schools being closed has brought to safeguarding children. So we talked about the influence of peer groups, we talked about the influence of benefits of friends, and we've talked about the different safeguarding responsibilities that exist across the sector. So I don't believe that anybody would argue that we are all concerned around the risks that children currently face, be it online, be it offline, within every environment that they are living within. So we can reasonably anticipate a surge at some point, and I made that point earlier on. In terms of the going back to school, ultimately, this has got to be a judgment call from my perspective between the scientists that are able to provide the best scientific and medical advice, working with the ministries across government to make the decision when it's actually safe for children to go back, because any parent or a grandparent, as I am, will just want to know that our children, our grandchildren are going to be able to return to school and be safe, and as far as possible, not be exposed to any unnecessary risk. And that's the juggling act. That's the challenge that faces the government ministers, the Secretary of State for Education. It's the challenge that the government faces, and ultimately it is the responsibility of the politicians, I believe, to give parents the confidence to know that their children can go back and be as safe as possible. And that is not a policing issue. Now, of course, they will have in their mind's eye the risks that they would all recognise, and there are constant conversations taking place across Westminster around the concerns around domestic abuse, around child abuse, around safeguarding issues. It is that balancing act, but ultimately, I believe it will come down to the government giving confidence to parents that it is safe for your children to return to school. We would all want them there, we would all recognise that, but to achieve that, the most important thing is that the confidence is provided to those parents so they can then say goodbye to their children and know that as far as possible that they are going to be safe and secure.
That's it. Denmark have gone back, haven't they? Justin, would you have something to say on that?
I think this is an incredibly complex issue. I think necessarily I've seen one forum where all the different dimensions to this conversation are really taking place. So as a parent, I'm obviously worried about my children going into school with a certain level of risk. As an educator, I'm desperate for them to get back into school because I want them to continue their education. As somebody who works in the field of safeguarding and wellbeing and classroom monitoring, I'm very keen to make sure that we are getting children who are at risk back into an environment where we can look after them. But I also recognise that whilst there's an element of choice, the very children we're trying to observe and interact with may not be sent to school. So there are so many different component parts to this that I think it's really difficult for us to really come up with one answer. I think this is going to be almost a case-by-case basis. I do not envy the school governors who right now are conducting risk assessments in their schools to try and understand the level of risk and whether or not they should be opening more widely to children coming in, and how they set the school up to accommodate it. Anecdotally, I'm hearing from teachers that they want children to come back. They want to be engaging with the children. They want to be back in the classroom and teaching, whatever that may look like. But of course, we don't know what it's going to look like. We don't really know what the children are going to experience as they come through the door. We don't know what baggage they're going to be bringing with them from the isolation, from potentially issues they have at home, potentially loss of a loved one. There are so many different facets to this that it's really hard to assess what the right environment is going to be. Teachers almost sign a pledge, a virtual pledge, if you like, to say that the first thing you do is you set up a safe environment for children to come into so they can really reach their potential, and you work on bringing that out of them. Are we doing that? It's a question 24 hours ago, I may well have given you a completely different answer, because I think this is an evolving feast. Every day we learn more, and we're going to need to assess that, and we need to be patient with the schools while they work it out. That's
definitely true, isn't it? Ceri, can I just ask you what your safeguarding priorities are for children coming back to school?
I think that it's going to be a tricky situation, because I think we want to be able to give them the opportunity to make any disclosures or to talk through how they're feeling, if they've been bullied, or I think perhaps more isolated. I think that there is bullying going on, but I think that there's been a lot of where they haven't been included in house party chats and they haven't been included in lots of things, so they're feeling even more isolated that way. So suddenly bringing them back into groups where suddenly they're seeing someone that has ignored them and not talked to them for 2 months is going to be awkward. So we need to give them space, but I can't visualize how that space is going to be, because we're going to be putting them in smaller groups that they've got to stay with for almost the whole day and the whole week. So they won't get a chance to see perhaps the other person they had a problem with. They're going to stay with one teacher who perhaps they don't know, so they haven't got that chance of building up a relationship. I've got to then support staff, because if they're suddenly getting lots of disclosures, they're going to feel drained, they're going to feel helpless, they're going to feel overwhelmed. It could bring up their own baggage. There's going to be so many different things, and I don't really see how it's going to work from a safeguarding point of view for the first few weeks, where we're trying to give people the chance to talk.
Uncharted territory, isn't it? Claude, what behaviours do you think teachers should be looking out for in children when they return to school?
I think teachers will realise that the young people, the children, have actually had very different experiences during lockdown. It's not been one sort of set of circumstances. So I think Ceri's mentioned, isolation, feelings of having been rejected, not understanding what's happened to them, really. I was speaking to the mother of a young child who told me that she didn't know how to cope with her son because he kept thinking that he was being punished. Overnight his schooling stopped. Overnight he couldn't see his friends. Everything was so sudden. And I mean, it broke her heart when he looked at her and said, "Have I been a bad boy? Is it my fault?" Can you imagine? And she just contacted me to help her process some of that with him. But for me, that was a sort of microcosm of feelings. And all of those may not and will not have all been resolved. So for me, when they go back, you've got all these variety of experiences and concerns. And so the first thing that schools, I believe, need to do is to help the young ones to reconnect. It's not everyone's aware here that we can't just plunge them back in and work as we were before. The world has changed, and the school scenarios have changed.
I was going to say to Charlotte, actually, what systems do schools need to have in place to ensure a safe and healthy transition? Do they need to do anything differently, would you say, Charlotte?
Oh, it's so challenging, isn't it, to think about what this new normality will look like. But I think there has to be an emphasis on children's mental health and their well-being, and that difficult transition that lots of them are going to make back into the classroom, if indeed they do at all. I think there'll have to be less focus on academic achievement and more focus on their well-being, their mental health, supporting them back into the school environment. I mean, for children who will potentially go back for a few weeks and then go straight to secondary school, that would be hugely concerning for me as a parent. I mean, my son's already at secondary school, and I think he's pretty resilient. But for those children who are potentially vulnerable, to go from a primary setting to a secondary setting is just going to be so difficult. And even then, in September, they may only be going in once, twice a week. Who knows how that's going to work? I mean, personally, I'd like to see schools take this time to really think about a new normality and to do potentially something quite radical. I think we're going to have to think quite differently about education going forward. Even in September, we probably aren't going to be in a position where we're going to be how we were before, kind of post, pre-March. I'd like to see much more emphasis on children's mental health and less emphasis on academic attainment, to be honest.
That's it. And just to go back to Claude for a second here, what signs of bullying would you be looking out for? How would you know that that's been going on during the lockdown?
Well, some children we know won't disclose that. It'll take a few sort of chats and observations. But certainly, some children would be more withdrawn, or they would be keeping away from a certain. Well, of course, we're going to have the social distancing, but they would be displaying a certain wariness in relation to some of their peers. They made their self-confidence, their self-esteem will have fallen if they've been bullied, while they've been at home, and there hasn't been an understanding, there hasn't been a structure to help them through it. So they may actually come back in a low frame of mind, feeling undermined, feeling undervalued, not ready for learning at all. And I'm taking up what Charlotte says. I think that the learning aspect, the learning readiness will take time. But if on top of that, children have been undermined and made to feel that that somehow they're lacking, or that they're not, you know, they're not up to the standard their peers would expect, and so on. That is going to be a huge problem, because that's going to take rebuilding, and indeed that overnight.
If I can ask the Chief Constable now, how do you think this pandemic will sort of shape how we do safeguarding in the future? Do you think you've learnt things and you thought that's a better way of doing it, or?
Sarah, I think it's probably a little bit too early to answer that from an informed position at this moment in time. I think the way that we work and the way the world looks after this is going to be very, very different. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The reliance and the use of technology like this is going to change our lives forever, because I think we've all realised that you can work from home very successfully, conduct conferences like this very successfully, and actually business can function. And my own business, you know, the Ceri business is a 175 million a year organisation. It's carried on pretty much seamlessly during the pandemic with people working from home, and it's been very successful. The challenge for us, and my personal view on it is that technology plays such a pivotal role in so many forms of abuse that the tech companies have got to do so much more. And if the tech companies do more, then children can be safer online, because we just know the volumes of people that we are arresting, the number of children that we are safeguarding every month just grows and grows and grows. But there is still that important interface interaction of the safeguarding experts, teachers within that environment, that I'm just not sure that technology is going to get you beyond the conversations that Ceri will be having within her school with students that she's concerned about. I'm just not sure that you can do it as well through this form of medium. So I think there is still going to be a really, really important role for those face-to-face conversations. And the point that was made earlier is, if there is one or any number of positive things that will come out of this, will be that if there is a far more joined up conversation across the Department for Health, communities, local government, Department for Education, the Home Office, that actually says, do you know what, we are all sitting and we're all privy to information that if we share it more efficiently and more effectively, children will be safer. And those conversations are taking place as a result of the pandemic. I now have a weekly dial-in with senior officials now from across government. I think that is one of the really positive things to come out of this. But we shouldn't ignore the importance of the work that the likes of Ceri and her colleagues do in the school environment, because there is always going to be that face-to-face requirement, and teachers, the safeguarding experts, play an absolutely pivotal role in all of this.
That's it. And if I could just ask Ceri and Justin, how you think safeguarding will change in schools after this lockdown, if at all?
I think there is a level of awareness that's grown over the last couple of months, for sure. You know, we're having more detailed conversations. Whether there's access to the tools or whether the tools are being used right now is a different question. I think moving forward, we're going to be seeing more schools taking this more seriously. And one of the things I think that I experienced when I was a teacher was that if there's a responsibility for something labelled with one person within a school, then very often it becomes that person's job for everybody to represent everything. I think what we'll see is that all teachers recognising they all have a pivotal part to play within that. They'll get much more involved in the process of safeguarding wellbeing. Even in secondary schools where it's very difficult. Remember, some teachers will only see a child for an hour a week. How do you really harvest information about that particular child? So I think some of these thornier issues are going to start to be borne out. But the immediate impact for me is, if I look at what we do as a business, if there was a life-changing event for an individual who then returned to work after a period away, we as a business would look how we induct them back into work. What can we do to help them? How can we support them? It might be brief, depending on the circumstances, or it might not be. It might be a lengthy process to bring them in over a period of time. Teachers, by nature, are change managers. That's what they do. They do it brilliantly and expertly. And yet I don't think they're being given the tools to induct an entire generation of children back into school after what has essentially been a life-changing event. So I think we need to be thinking about this much more seriously. There probably does need to be more central guidance to support teachers and to support Ceri and her peers in bringing children back into the school environment, because it isn't, as you said earlier, just turn it off. You can't do.
Ceri, just to pick up on that then, as Justin was saying, what do you think is going to change safeguarding wise in schools after all this?
I mean, I really would love if, as Simon says, that we start communicating with lots of other support mechanisms, not just the health. I mean, there are many that you do build a relationship with, and the police, but obviously counties, if we could actually talk more and be more the same with different counties. I'm on a border of 3 different counties, and they all work in completely different ways, and they all have different support systems or charities in place, which is great, but if you don't know each system, then it gets really complicated. So if we could change safeguarding so that it is more generic, it is more the same, and we communicate, that would make everything much easier. I think it is really interesting to hear how everyone is being really great about saying that, coming back and focus on well-being and positivity. I am slightly nervous that that isn't going to be the case, that we're going to be focusing so much on social distancing, washing hands, giving them the space. And then we've got the pressure from exam boards, and we've got the pressure from government to still achieve the same kind of high standards that we're meant to be achieving. Even the exam boards now are starting to say we're not being any different for year 10s or year 12s, starting coursework already. So I'd love to say that we're going to start with pastoral and rethinking it through, but I'm not convinced that that's how it's going to be.
And follow-up question, Ceri, can you give an example of a safeguarding issue that you have dealt with during lockdown?
Yeah, so I mean, there's quite a few different little things, and there's little nuggets, as you said, you don't know it's part of the jigsaw. One I had 3 or 4 days ago, a student was writing a piece of work for drama, don't you just love drama lessons? And it was about a bit disclosure she was making, and the teacher could straight away screenshot it, put it onto our virtual system that we've got for recording systems. It pinged straight away to me. I could look up exactly what it was, see if it's part of a jigsaw. Actually, it was. I knew about the child. I knew what else was going on with the child. It just added more information to it, and I could send it straight onto the social worker.
And I'm just thinking about the resources, and I don't know who could answer this. Do you think schools have the resources to deal with safeguarding issues? I don't know if it's allocated in terms of how many at-risk children you've got at your school or something like that.
Our sort of core product around safeguarding wellbeing free for all schools across the UK, deliberately because we recognise that so many schools were not using digital systems. So we've taken a subset of our full system and we've made that free. And it's not free just for the next 30 days, it's actually free for good. And we think that we've done so because we recognise there is a gap, and there are a number of schools that don't have access to the right resources.
Yes, so that's something that you've been able to do to help out, kind of thing. And just looking on to Charlotte, are schools still waiting on relevant governmental departments, do you think, to give clear guidelines on safeguarding issues and remote learning? Do you think it's too late to have those guidelines? Have you had any guidelines, would you say, Charlotte?
There have been some guidelines, yes. I mean, I was listening to a teacher talking this morning who said she'd had 16 documents from DFE in the last 2 weeks, and that she'd read every single one of them cover to cover. So there have been guidelines. I think actually at the moment it's quite challenging to keep on top of all of the information that is coming through, because initially I certainly felt that there wasn't enough support for schools in delivering remote learning, and some of the do's and don'ts around what they should and shouldn't be doing, i.e., you know, should they be delivering like we are now? Should they be communicating with students outside of school hours? Should they be directly messaging students via the apps that lots of schools use? Should they be using their virtual learning environments? And I had a quick look at some of the guidance that DFE certainly have provided around that issue this morning, and it doesn't give clarity on every single area. What it does do is it says things like you should update your policy to reflect, you should be providing remote learning, and you should update your safeguarding policy to reflect your new situation, which, as Ceri's just pointed out, probably a lot of her work has been around updating policies to make sure in this brave new world, everything is in the policy, so that if a parent challenges something that a school or a teacher is doing, it's written down in the policy. So I think there has been a lot of guidance. I think there are issues that certainly schools need more clarity on. I think if this is going to be extended, this remote learning, and it might be a blended learning approach in September, it might be a bit of face-to-face and a bit of remote learning as well, then we do need to have much clearer guidelines around some of the topics that schools, some of the challenges that schools are faced with at the moment. Lots and lots of questions about what they should be delivering and how that should work.
Yeah, do you think in a way this has sort of been quite an opportunity to see how technology can work in terms of keeping in touch with pupils? I know my children's school, they email in a lot of homework. Is that totally standard now, that they're all using technology and remote learning to some extent, or not really? You're shaking your head, Ceri, and Charlotte.
I mean, as a person who's worked in the kind of tech industry, especially in the education system for 20 years, and for someone like Vector, whose responsibility was to put tech in the classroom, schools have had the kit and the technology to be able to deliver remote learning via VLEs or various apps or websites for a long time. They haven't necessarily had the opportunity to do it in the way that they have now. And I think there's lots of variation around how schools are meeting this challenge. And I think that at the moment, there isn't really parity for students around the experience that they're getting around the remote learning. Some schools are doing, like I say, things like this, where you have a teacher delivering to groups of students. Some schools are emailing homework. I mean, you know, notwithstanding that schools have to cater for all of their students who may not have tech, or who may not have parents in the home who can necessarily support their learning in that way. You know, we used to call it the digital divide. So there's all sorts of challenges around that. But again, we need to recognise that lots of students aren't getting this parity of education that we would expect in a face-to-face environment, and that's going to be another challenge for us to deal with going forward. What
would you say about that, Ceri? I saw you nodding, and
yeah,
I'm coming to you in a second, Simon.
I think it is so different for every child. It's not just technology. It could also be some special educational needs, specifically maybe some kids who've got Asperger's. They find this kind of situation very challenging. They don't want to talk to a face-to-face. They find it very different. Now, obviously, every child is different. I'm not specifically just saying those ones children don't like this kind of thing, but you've got to be aware also that it could be that they're embarrassed of their background, so you need to blur backgrounds. It could be that they are embarrassed about what they look like, so then they don't want to talk, and then they're worried about their voice, they're worried about they're going to get teased. There's so many variables. There's also the idea that you don't want to bombard them, you don't want to kind of overload them. And I think that as long as parents know what teachers are doing and they're okay with it, then we're fine. But it needs to be clarity going through, saying this teacher, this school, this is what we're providing and this is how we're going to do it. I think that's the best way forward. I think it's the unknown and comparing against everyone else, that doesn't work.
Just one for the Chief Constable now. You were saying, you know, it'd be great if you had a kind of weekly meeting with all the different agencies and the police and the teacher and the social teams and everything. I mean, is that sort of just too much of a pipe dream in terms of putting those resources into saying, right, little Freddie's got these issues this week or whatever? Is it just too resource intensive?
No, I don't think it is, Sarah, because if you actually look at the majority of multi-agency safeguarding arrangements around the country, I think they're getting better and better. I think the awareness of adverse childhood experiences is getting better and better. For me, the importance is ensuring that there is the join up across Westminster. So it's that activity between Department for Health, Department for Education, Department for Communities and local media and sport, for the DFE. That for me is the key, whereby the ministries set that strategic ambition that actually information can be freely shared, concerns can be freely raised within safe environments, and then everybody accepts that as part of their core role, it is the safeguarding of children. rather than it being done, what I often fear is in isolation. And if we can get a fully joined up whole system approach to it, then our response to safeguarding of children will be improved.
But are all those Department of Health, Department of whatever, on different systems? They're all closed, you need permissions, because it's all confidential information. Is that the problem?
Well, there are some challenges around technology, but actually those challenges can be overcome. And we have seen some very, very successful sites across the country where you have 50 or 60 partners sharing information to ensure that safeguarding is at the forefront of the process. And where that works and it's been seen to work, then it's making a big difference.
Big difference. So it can work if we
Yes,
kind of make
absolutely.
it work, kind of thing. And I just wondering, Claude, is that your dog in the background?
Oh, it's my dog.
Oh, it's your dog, Simon. All right, yes. I don't know if you, just on a slightly off topic thing, do you think some teachers have said that the year groups that they're talking about going back, the reception year 1, year 6, are the wrong year groups? I don't know if anyone has a view on that.
There's one thing that concerns me, it's picking up on something Simon said. We've had different departments banding around figures, so many million for this, so without much coordination. We've even had contradictions between the departments almost the next hour. And I think this really is a huge problem. The lack of joined up thinking at that level really worries me. You were asking earlier, is that enough money? Well, who has looked at that figure and who's consulted with people on the ground to see what they would do with it? I think. Sorry, Sarah, that wasn't the main question you were asking, though.
That's all right. We've had a couple of questions in from our audience, as it were. One for the Chief Constable, if that's all right. What do you see as the responsibilities of tech platforms during the crisis? With increased social media traffic as children communicate more online, should they be stepping up and doing a better job of seeking and flagging inappropriate contacts and content? And Justin, you can answer that after Simon.
I mean, Sarah, I've been a very public and I'd like to think prominent critique of what I think the tech companies haven't done. They have a social and moral responsibility to ensure that children can go online and be safe. And the headline figure is that they are not doing enough. The online harms white paper, I think, has the potential to make a real difference. But at this moment in time, too many children are being abused online. Too many children are at risk. We are probably the best in the world across law enforcement tackling the online threat. But as I keep saying, it feels very hollow. We're arresting over 700 people a month for viewing child abuse imagery and for grooming children online, safeguarding 500 children every month. But the bottom line is the numbers just keep on growing and growing and growing. So much more has to be done by the tech companies, not just now in lockdown. It should have been being done years ago, and they still have a long way to go to give me the confidence that children can be safe when they go on the web and they start to talk to their friends, they start to play their games, they use social media, because at this moment in time, there is too much risk there for me.
Just a reminder to our attendees, our audience, to send in any questions. We're just in the last couple of few minutes of the webinar, if you've got any more questions. But I think Justin and maybe Claude were wanting to answer that as well, about the tech companies.
One thing that worries me so much is that, sorry, Justin.
No, go on, after you.
Just one important point I feel is that so many of the directives have not been mandatory. The industry's been asked to do something, but it's not, there haven't been any teeth to that. And I do hope that the white paper, which has been mentioned a few times, brings those very necessary teeth so that there are consequences to inaction, if you like. Sorry, Justin.
Justin.
So, the phrase tech is a huge term. It covers such a huge breadth of different services that are being offered in space. But principally, I think it's right that all different parts of the tech industry should be doing absolutely everything they possibly can to protect children, and not just children, because learners are of all ages and there are vulnerabilities through all ages. So actually, we should be considering this not as a restriction of freedoms, but just a sensible monitoring and a sensible use of technology to protect as many people as humanly possible. I think it's morally right. I think it's something that we should be doing Legislatively, it should be something that is monitored both through the police forces and others. I think that you know, we take it extremely seriously, and in fact we bring in experts from outside our organisation to come in and check that we're doing things right on a regular basis. We've just gone through an ISO certification around information security. We've passed that. We'll be doing more and more and more and more continually. And obviously we work in, I don't know if we've said this earlier, but we work across 90 different countries. So we're not only looking at what happens here in the UK, we're trying to cover off the legislation in many, many, many different countries. And actually the Chief Constable's right. You know, what the UK sets as a standard is head and shoulders above most countries in the world that we're experiencing. But that isn't to say that we're doing enough, and it isn't to say that all parties are doing enough.
That's it. And Charlotte, I think you were wanting to answer something on this one about what the tech platforms should do more.
Yeah. I mean, as Simon said, the online harms bill was at the point of being enacted, but because of everything that's happened, it's taken a slight backseat, and I would certainly be arguing strongly that right now it needs to be put at the fore, and the actions that are detailed in that online harms bill around transparency and moderating and making sure that people are held to account if children come to harm on their platforms is absolutely crucial right now. It really is more important than ever before because of the sheer volume of children and young people that are using those platforms. And it simply at the moment isn't good enough that we are putting that on hold. And I think, you know, that's a really strong message that certainly the children's charities have been promoting and pushing out, that right now at this moment something needs to happen and we can't afford to leave it any longer.
And that white paper is on hold. Has anything been said about how it'll progress, or?
I at the moment I don't know. I've seen a few people, there's rumblings going on around that it's at the point of being driven forward, and rumblings going on that it's one of the things that will take priority, but whether that is the case, I mean, at the moment we just simply don't know.
And I don't know how easy it is for those tech platforms to kind of control the content. I suppose they can have the algorithms that spot certain words and certain pictures, but if someone decides to register as a 13-year-old boy and they're actually a 55-year-old man, can you do anything about that? Or maybe you can track people's identity, Justin.
It depends on the system that you're promoting. So if you are, as a tech organisation, you believe in certain freedoms, and certainly we know some platforms that do, then it becomes hard to track down the individual. But we have 24,000 keywords that we've compiled with most of the leading charities in the UK, specifically so that we can track anything of particular harm. And so we are monitoring continually on devices what children are doing, specifically to try and track against those keywords to be able to flag moving forward. That isn't something that, you know, that is impossible. It is something that we are doing today, and we will continue to work to compile those keywords and to make sure that we're current and staying ahead of all the different issues that are out there. Other tech companies can take advantage of organisations like ours to do that legwork for them, and we are here to do that work. I think it's something that is often downplayed, and very often is sort of hidden behind a philosophy rather than looking at what is something that's necessary.
Just a question for Ceri, which has come in from the chat. Do you think that new teachers are aware of the role they have in safeguarding when they start the job?
I think that every new person starting will have a safeguarding induction with one of the safeguarding leads. And I think very quickly there, they will pick up what's expected from them. The training at schools, the training at universities changed tremendously. I mean, I remember when I did it a long time ago, it was I think 2-hour lecture, and that was it over my time. Now it's definitely quite serious. And of course, in an interview, there is some safeguarding questions. So even from the word go, even before they started the school, they'd have picked up that safeguarding is a priority. And the training is a lot more intense when you start. You get an induction day, which kind of scares you a little bit because we focus on what could be happening. But then we make sure we support every new staff that joins. But I think safeguarding, I think everyone picks up now that safeguarding is really important. It's changed so much.
Yes, actually, it's a bit like nutrition, isn't it? When you do a medical degree, it's like one day's nutrition training kind of thing. Does it then become 1% of your job, 10% of your job? Does it become a big part of your job?
Yes, well, it depends. I mean, it depends. If you're an NQT and you don't have, say, a tutor group, then perhaps you could be just spotting signs. If you're a tutor, if you've got a group that you're with all the time, it can take up quite a big chunk. If you've got a vulnerable child within your class, then I would say it takes up a huge amount of your time. You could be attending regular meetings with social services. You could be contacting social services to do reviews. You could be termly reviews online. It can take up a huge amount of your time.
And I suppose, Charlotte or Claude, it's not a particular strata of society that this affects, is it? It can be going through any type of school or any type of pupil.
It's like bullying, you know, it crosses all barriers, isn't it? It's not about class or age, or it's something that it could happen to anyone.
Yeah.
One has to be aware of that. I've had concerns for some time about you say it's improved, Ceri, and I'm pleased to hear that, but you say take a topic like bullying, which is a safeguarding issue. Some students, teachers, will only have had an hour or two. I remember delivering something to Goldsmith. It was like a 1.5 hour lecture, and then I was told by the tutor that, there's a tick, you know, that's it, they've done that. And I'm thinking, my goodness, you know, I've only scratched the surface. You know, I think the inductions in schools are becoming more and more important. And those schools that do it well are rewarded by the fact that they have a more aware and competent staff in relation to those issues. But it's still sometimes marginalised in secondary schools where the subject teaching seems to be still, you know, the golden standard, if you like. Whereas we're teaching whole children, you know, we're teaching, say, children to use maths or to use geography. It's the whole child, it's not just the subject.
And actually, one for Charlotte and Simon, if I can, just kind of following on from that, are there any groups of children who are more vulnerable to this or less vulnerable? I don't know whether police see certain families again and again, they say, don't they?
The online threat doesn't recognise any form of social strata, full stop. So the notion that too many parents have that their child isn't hanging around on a street corner, is up in their bedroom and is online and is safe is just an absolute misnomer. And I have got to know professional parents whose children have been subject to the most appalling forms of abuse, and they didn't know it was taking place. So any notion that you fit a particular risk category, I'm sorry, is just a myth. This recognises no barriers at all.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And it's important to recognise that sometimes children can go in and out of vulnerability depending on their current circumstance and current situation. And at the moment, again, we've probably got more children that would potentially be in that vulnerable category because they're quite isolated, and they're going to be online more. I would say, though, the positive side of the online area around supporting children is that what we do know is, particularly teenagers, support services like Childline, which are where you can talk to somebody online relatively anonymously and have a conversation that you might potentially find quite difficult face-to-face with a parent or with a teacher or even with a peer, are proving to be very positive for children. And there's lots of services and support out there, like Young Minds, like Childline, who are providing services to children during this lockdown and outside of this lockdown. And it means that they can talk relatively anonymously about some of the issues that concern them. And there's quite a bit of evidence, especially for teenagers, that says, you know, they find this much easier than having these really awkward face-to-face conversations, especially around sex and relationships. But that means that all of these services that sit behind that have to be joined up, that we've already talked about. It means that in order for children to be able to access the support that they need, either from social services or police, lots of these services need to be joined up, which at the moment they're probably not as joined up as we would like them to be.
Just to let our attendees know that the recording of all of this webinar is going to be made available to you after the webinar has finished in the next couple of hours, and also the research commissioned by Impero, which we referred to earlier on in the session. And we're working up to finishing and rounding up this webinar now. So if I could maybe just have a kind of final thought that you would like, if there's one thing you want people to remember from today's webinar about safeguarding, just give me your final nugget. And if I can come to the Chief Constable first.
The most important thing coming out for me is our preparedness for when lockdown is lifted, children return to school. We've all got to be prepared to cope with, I predict, what would have been previously unforeseen demand, and how we then go and prioritise the risk that we're presented with.
Right, okay, and that preparation includes a lot of different bits, as we were hearing. So I'll come to Claude now, if you don't mind.
Yes, I'd like to just, yes, all of that, and also that to be aware that in our classes, in school classrooms across Britain, there would be young people who are particularly vulnerable because of their, if you like, their ethnic identity. I've been dealing with a situation where some Chinese children have been subjected to horrendous bullying, even during the lockdown, as they've been out and about in a safe way. So just to be aware that there are some vulnerabilities that are there just because of the situation and the misinformation, the false news. So just another aspect to this very, very complex and multifaceted issue and problem.
Because of the Wuhan and all of this kind of connection with the lockdown, yes, okay.
Yes, and some of the way that the irresponsible press have been perhaps reporting that in the early days. Yes, I mean, it's, for families who are being shunned and people running away from them and shouting, it's your fault, it's all your fault. And the children particularly being very concerned about going back to school because they've received very horrible messages from peers who were quite fine with them before. So the racism basically that could and has arisen from this.
Yes, the sort of Donald Trumpism, as it were, isn't it? Charlotte, if I can come to you briefly.
I think what I would like to see is much more focus on children's well-being and their mental health when they go back into that transition of school, and really supporting them through that transition and making it a priority, actually, that they feel safe and secure in whatever environment it is, whether it's home or school, because we all know that children can't learn effectively unless they feel safe and secure. So I would really like to see this kind of radical approach around making sure that they feel that in as far as possible in the current circumstances.
An anxious child doesn't learn, they say, don't they? Just very briefly, Justin, in 30 seconds.
For me, I think it's use the tools available, and I'm talking to parents, to teachers, to other learners as well. There are services out there, there are tools available. Use them, get the guidance and get the support, and let's work on this together.
Fantastic. And Ceri, you're last on my screen.
I think, yes, working together, communication, trying to talk to as many different people as possible, and giving the child to talk, because they might not talk the first week, it might be the second week. Just give them the time and give everyone the time.
Fantastic.
There's been a collective community trauma, and we're all going to have to go through a period of healing, even those people going back to work after working from home. It's about, it's not going to be the same. We have to heal before we can restore.
It has been, hasn't it? Absolutely unprecedented when this lockdown started in my lifetime. There's in none of our lifetimes has there ever been any, even in the war, there's not been something like this, has there? I would like to say thank you so much to all of you for taking part in this and for your insights and your contributions. And that's been amazing and really useful. And thank you very much for giving us your time. I've also got to thank, of course, our producers, Sian Evans at Top Line Film, and also our question moderator, Katie Chodosh at Top Line Communications. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking part. I guess we all just leave the meeting, don't you? But that's the end of what we've got to say today. Thank you so much. Give us a wave. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.